Hey students, it's Mr. Luchero. So in this video, I just want to record the lesson that I gave this morning. There were three major objectives from this lesson. The first of which is we reviewed the free energy diagrams. The second, I introduced cellular energetics. And third, we talked about the free energy carrier of the cell, which is known as ATP. So let's get started with what we talked about first, which was about these free energy diagrams. And so again, free energy is defined as energy that is available in a system to do work. Not all energy in a system is available to do work, so free energy is referring to the available energy. And so we can use this measurement of free energy to measure the energy transfer in a reaction. So remember that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed or transferred. And so free energy is transferred depending on the reaction in different ways. And so there are two key categories of reactions that are represented with what we call free energy diagrams. And those two categories, which are going to be key as we understand the reactions that we're going to talk about in unit number 3, those two categories are exergonic and endergonic reactions. So exergonic is defined as a reaction in which we say the delta G, which delta just refers to the change in free energy, is less than 0, meaning that free energy is released into the surrounding environment. Now, when we look at these reaction diagrams, what it's typically drawn as is with Gibbs free energy on the y-axis and time on the x. And time is just referring to kind of the overall progress of the reaction. And so we know that for every reaction, we start with reactants and we end with products. Now, you can notice a couple things from this line that's drawn. The first is that the reactants, they actually have a higher amount of energy, free energy, than the products. So that's the first key thing about exergonic reactions. The reactants have higher energy than the products. Now, over the course of the reaction, since the products have less free energy, that difference, that change, represents the free energy that's released into the surrounding system. Now, at this point, I also mentioned this idea of stability. And we can use this idea of stability to understand how exergonic reactions are spontaneous. And so when we think about reactants and products in an exergonic reaction, it's said that the reactants are less stable. So the molecules at the beginning of the reaction are less stable than the molecules that are the products, which are more stable. And so this reaction is spontaneous, which is another way of saying that it's going to tend to occur because the products are much more stable than the reactants. Okay, now the other thing that we see in this diagram is that before we get to the products, there's this little bump. And this bump is referred to as the activation energy, or E subscript A is how it's annotated. And it almost forms a barrier, right? There's a little bit of free energy that needs to be added in order to kickstart this reaction. And once that gets over that activation energy, the reaction will continue on its own towards the more stable products. Okay, now endergonic reactions, on the other hand, we can think about just in a lot of ways as the opposite. So instead of having less stable reactants, we start with more stable reactants, and we end with less stable products. Now, these types of reactions are not spontaneous because, again, molecules are going to prefer to be in a more stable state. And so this is going to require free energy to be added, lots of free energy to be added in order to allow these reactants to be rearranged into the products. And so we say that the delta G of this reaction is greater than 0 because it absorbs free energy in order to allow this to happen. Okay, so with that in mind, the other thing that I mentioned was that we can also think about two major categories of reactions in biology that are commonly associated with exergonic and energonic reactions. And those terms were anabolic and catabolic. So starting with an anabolic reaction. So an anabolic reaction is where you build molecules. You build larger molecules. One of the most common types of anabolic reaction could be something like dehydration synthesis, which we saw in Unit 1. Now, anabolic reactions, typically you start with more stable reactants and you build larger molecules that are not as stable, but oftentimes they store large amounts of energy. And we'll see some examples in just a moment. But anabolic reactions, for that reason, they tend to be associated with endergonic reactions. They're almost always going to be endergonic. On the other hand, the opposite of an anabolic reaction is a catabolic reaction. So a catabolic reaction is where you're actually breaking down larger molecules, typically to release energy. Now, one of the ways that we've mentioned is hydrolysis, right, as being in the opposite of a dehydration synthesis reaction. Now, typically catabolic reactions are exergonic, and we're going to see one of the major ones in biology in just a moment. Okay, so hopefully this gives you an idea of how to interpret these energy diagrams. The last thing that I'll say is just about activation energy. So if you remember here, right, there was a small amount of energy needed to start the reaction, but hopefully you see there's much larger amounts of energy that's needed to not only start an endergonic reaction, but allow the endergonic reaction to proceed, right? Because most of it is requiring energy to be added. Okay. So let's talk about two major reactions in biology that are related to these terms, exergonic and endergonic. So those two reactions are probably familiar. Cellular respiration and photosynthesis, you likely learned about in a prior science class. But these are the two major reactions that we're going to learn about in Unit 3. Now, we're going to learn about them much more in depth than you've likely learned about them before. But just to recall, cellular respiration is where we take glucose and oxygen, and over a few phases that we're going to learn about, that results in carbon dioxide and water being the outputs of that reaction. Now, this mainly happens inside the mitochondria that we're going to learn about in Unit 3. But the other reaction, photosynthesis, is actually just, in a lot of ways, the opposite. So we have carbon dioxide and water being rearranged into oxygen, and I apologize for the typo here, and glucose. All right, one of the most important energy storage molecules that's produced in photosynthesis. And this occurs in the chloroplast, an organelle in plant cells. Now, to relate this back to these energy diagrams that we saw in the previous portion of this lesson, we can think about cellular respiration is an exergonic reaction overall. So again, here's an exergonic free energy diagram. So if we think about the reactants being glucose and oxygen, and the products being carbon dioxide and water, over the course of cell respiration, glucose is actually broken down and rearranged into these products. And as a result, lots of free energy is released into the surrounding system. And we're actually going to talk about how a cell, particularly in the mitochondria, how it harvests that free energy. But we can understand cell respiration as being overall an exergonic process. If we think about the function is to release the energy stored in glucose. Okay, on the other hand, photosynthesis is an endergonic process. And same thing, so endergonic process that starts with, in this case, carbon dioxide and water and ends with oxygen and glucose. This requires lots of energy in order to rearrange those reactants into the products. And if you think about how glucose is used in cell respiration, this makes sense, right? Because that molecule is intended to store lots of energy. And so it's going to require lots of free energy to be added to the system in order for that reaction to occur. Now, we mentioned that most of that free energy for photosynthesis is going to be coming from solar energy, right? The sun is going to provide lots of free energy that's going to be harvested and absorbed by different structures in the chloroplasts that's going to allow this endergonic reaction to occur. So to give you an idea of where we're going for Unit 3, we're going to be spending the first third of this unit talking more about reaction energetics and something called enzymes, which again you'll be learning about over the weekend. And then the second third we're going to be spending on cell respiration. We're going to understand the different phases of cell respiration and how a cell uses cell respiration to release energy from glucose. And then the last third we're going to spend talking about the different phases of photosynthesis. Okay. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about our last thing today, which was about ATP. Okay, so ATP, which stands for adenosine triphosphate, is known as the free energy carrier of the cell because its structure allows for really efficient storage and release of energy. And so first, let's start with the structure. So ATP, which is right here, it has three structural components. It has phosphate groups, has three of them. It has a ribose sugar, and it has a nitrogenous base. Now, it was at this point where I mentioned the similarities between an ATP molecule and a nucleotide, particularly an adenine from RNA. If you look at the structure of nucleotides, right, you typically have a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. And ATP shares in a lot of ways, aside from the extra phosphate groups, it shares its structure with adenine. Okay, so how does this molecule actually store and release energy? Well, so if you take a look at this diagram right here, I like to think of ATP as a charged battery. And that really comes down to this third phosphate group. See, when that third phosphate group is actually removed or broken off, it results in energy being released, energy that can be channeled into doing different things in the cell. ADP, which, as the name suggests, involves only two phosphate groups instead of three, you can think about as a used battery, right? Now, there are reactions that allow that third phosphate to be reattached, but that requires energy because you're, in a sense, recharging that ADP back into its high energy state. Okay, now we're going to relate this to those energy diagrams, and then we'll get into something that is extremely important in this unit, which is called energy coupling. Now, if you look at these diagrams, we have our exergonic right here and our endergonic here. Okay, now if you think about these reactions that I just mentioned with ATP and ADP, the exergonic reaction would be where we have ATP, which is the high energy state of this molecule, breaking off that third phosphate to become ADP plus an inorganic phosphate, which is just that phosphate that's been broken off. That process is exergonic because it releases free energy into the surroundings. We call this process of removing that third phosphate, we call this ATP hydrolysis. ATP hydrolysis. Now the opposite, right, the recharging that we saw over here, is an energonic reaction. So we start with the low energy form, ADP and inorganic phosphate. And by adding energy into the system, we can recharge it into its high energy state of ATP. Okay, and that process is called ADP phosphorylation. And hopefully that name makes sense based on what we know is happening in this reaction. We're adding that phosphate back onto the ADP molecule. Okay, so with those two processes in mind, hydrolysis and phosphorylation, I want to talk about this last thing, which is called energy coupling. Now, energy coupling, it's defined right here. It's actually where we use an exergonic reaction to fuel an endergonic process. And this makes sense because if you've seen in these diagrams, right, every time an exergonic reaction occurs, some amount of free energy is released into the surrounding system. So it makes sense if you could use that energy to then fuel a reaction that needs energy, such as an endergonic process. And so that's what energy coupling is referring to. So if we think about ATP hydrolysis, so ATP hydrolysis, which is an exergonic reaction, is commonly used to accomplish three major types of endergonic processes in the cell. The first one we can think about in terms of chemical work of a cell. So there are all of these processes, reactions happening inside of a cell, some of which require energy. One of the most common examples, to use a term we saw earlier, are dehydration synthesis reactions in the cell. Now, some of the most common ones are things like transcription, translation, and DNA replication. And remember what dehydration synthesis means. It's where you're building a polymer, and that requires energy. And so often ATP hydrolysis will be coupled with those processes to allow them to occur. And transcription to build that mRNA, and translation to build that polypeptide, and in DNA replication to build that new DNA molecule, right? That requires energy, and so we can couple it with ATP hydrolysis. The second category that we can think about of energy coupling of ATP hydrolysis is with transport work. Now, if you remember in Unit 2, we talked about active transport, where we move substances from low concentration areas to high concentration areas, and how there are proteins on the membrane that allow that to happen. But that requires energy, and so ATP hydrolysis is coupled with that process in order to allow it to occur, to push substances against their concentration gradient. The third type is movement work. So there are cells that can physically move using structures called cilia. But we can also relate this to what we saw in Unit 2 with motor proteins, right? So motor proteins which move along the microtubules to move vesicles from one place in the cell to the other. It requires energy, and so it's often coupled with ATP hydrolysis to allow that to happen. Okay, so those are three major categories of cellular work that are paired with or coupled with ATP hydrolysis. Okay, now the last part of this is the reverse. So ADP phosphorylation is an endergonic process. So what exergonic processes are coupled with ADP phosphorylation? And this is what we're going to really learn about in Unit 3. The first two processes are involved in, or are part of, cell respiration. So the first one is called glycolysis. Now, glycolysis is the first phase of three phases of cellular respiration. And during glycolysis, something called substrate level phosphorylation occurs. And this is just referring to a moment in glycolysis where a reaction happens that is exergonic, that's coupled with ADP being phosphorylated back into ATP. The second process that's coupled with ADP phosphorylation is in the electron transport chain. There's a process called oxidative phosphorylation. This happens at the very end of cellular respiration. This is the third of three phases in cell respiration, where large amounts of ADP molecules are phosphorylated. And we'll learn about that next week. And the last process that we're going to see is coupled with ADP phosphorylation actually occurs during the light-dependent reactions. And this is in photosynthesis. All right, so these first two, this is cellular respiration. This last one is the first of two phases in photosynthesis. There's a portion of the light-dependent reactions where an exergonic process is used to phosphorylate some ADP. Now remember that photosynthesis overall is an endergonic process, but there are some exergonic steps involved in photosynthesis that again, in this case, are used to phosphorylate some ADP. So again, I hope that was helpful. If you missed anything from this morning, reach out if you need any clarity on any of these topics. I hope you have a nice weekend and stay safe.